Psycho-Delic sound of Naz Nomad and the Nightmares!
In 1984, something strange and, for the most part, rather unnoticed had been bubbling away in the corners of a music world that we might kindly say had been lacking excitement for a few years. A resurgence of interest in psychedelic garage rock had led to fanzines, new labels specialising in reissues, odd compilations and new bands that were in thrall to psych and garage punk. On the one hand, there was the Paisley Underground from America's West Coast, but hugely beloved of alternative DJs, Whistle Test and the music press in the UK for a while. Bands like the Long Riders, the Rain Parade and Green on Red, loved by critics, but ultimately unable to really break into the mainstream in any significant way. The only bands who did make it big from that scene were fringe travellers like the Bangles and arguably R.E.M. On the other hand, there were the likes of the Fuzztones, Doctor and the Medics and others who played with the sounds and the imagery of the 1965 to 1969 era. And that's not getting into clubs like Alice in Wonderland in London, where many of the neo/retro psych bands and their fans gathered. All in all, it was a remarkable scene that no one has heard of, or indeed seemed aware of at the time. You'll never see the British psych revival mentioned in books or documentaries about the 1980s. Even though there was a lot of knowing nostalgia and retro posing, the whole movement was authentically underground simply because it went entirely unnoticed by all but a handful of too young to have been there at the time kids and hipster clubbers. I was too young and too far away to go to any of the 1980s clubs, but as a kid who had been snapping up 80s by 1960s psych bands at a time when it was the most unfashionable thing in the world to do, the new movement was very much appreciated. I mean, there were no cool points to be gained from owning a copy of In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida or Kick Out the Jams back then, so having new music that revived the spirit of 1960s acid rock was great. For some, the need to be authentic examples of 1960s psychedelia meant reinvention as bands that had never actually existed, but which were now presented as genuine acts from the time. These bands were somewhere between authentic alternative projects and satire, certainly done with a sense of tongue-in-cheek humour, but also allowing existing bands to reinvent themselves as characters from an alternate universe. This was long before the days of bands generally having multiple side projects, so if you wanted to do something outside your established sound, you probably had to do so under a false name. It allowed bands to explore different sounds and have fun doing so without ever having to face cries of selling out. The Dukes of Stratosphere were hyped as a mysterious, newly discovered psych act from the 1960s, but were actually a spin-off of XTC, and they released a couple of albums that actually outsold XTC's official LPs at the time. Make of that what you will. The albums by the Dukes were fun pastiches, but arguably second division psych. Had they been an actual 1960s band, you could easily understand why they'd not achieved the heights and longevity of the likes of Quicksilver Messenger Service, The Seeds and the 13th Floor Elevators. More interesting and slightly more mysterious were Naz Nomad and the Nightmares, the unknown band behind the soundtrack to the equally unknown 1967 acid-drenched exploitation film Give Daddy the Knife, Cindy. Here was an act and a film that felt very much like the definition of bad acid 60s psych madness. Yet both also felt suspiciously fake in a way that you couldn't quite put your finger on. In 1984, there was no internet to allow researchers to look up and become instant experts in even the most obscure lost movies. The Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film was a couple of years away. There was no Something Weird, no Incredibly Strange Films. All this information on previously forgotten films was bubbling away under the surface, being slowly explored and discovered by the new generation of cult movie fanzines and fly-by-night video labels that would sometimes unearth the most obscure titles that occasionally hadn't even been finished. We'll perhaps talk about the remarkable case of Deathbed, the Bed That Eats at some later point. All this really did was make everyone aware that there was a whole world of forgotten cinema out there, one that had not been catalogued or discussed in movie books or magazines. So at the time, it was entirely plausible that Give Daddy the Knife Cindy might have been a real film that was lost in the vaults of director Quarry Richards, or whoever owned American Screen Destiny Pictures. After all, weird movies that we'd never heard of before were clogging up the shelves of video stores, and weird music that we'd never heard of before was filtering through via Nuggets compilations and assorted imitators. It was entirely plausible. The music on this newly reissued soundtrack LP certainly sounded authentic, as well it might, being covers of some familiar and some obscure garage psych hits of the era, including the Electric Prunes' I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night. This in itself might have raised eyebrows, but it was just possible that even if Naz Nomad and the Nightmares wasn't an authentic band, they might have at least been a collective of session men created just for this project, as many a 1960s youth film soundtrack band was. Around the same time that this album was released, the blast first Savage Pencil LP Angel Dust Music for Movie Bikers was released, featuring tracks from the soundtracks of films like Satan's Sadists, fuzz-drenched heavy psych tunes often performed by grizzled session men pretending to be actual bands. It seemed possible that Naz Nomad and the Nightmares could be a similar group of jobbing musicians cranking out alternative versions of current hits for a film score. Not just possible, in fact, but the most likely explanation for a film that had slipped into obscurity. Yes, these were clearly musicians for hire, accidentally capturing the deranged spirit of the age through a series of cover versions. Or they might have been the Damned, as indeed it turns out that they were. You can only keep a secret like this for so long. Indeed, commercial considerations often demand that the person behind a nom de plume be revealed after a while. Just ask J.K. Rowling. The music press knew the truth but played along with the joke for a while dropping enough hints to allow fans to work out the connections themselves. The band hid under pseudonyms, or should we say fresh pseudonyms, given that they were not exactly known under their birth names to begin with. Dave Vanian was Naz Nomad, Roman Jug was Sphinx Fenson, Rat Scabies was Nick Detroit, and so on. How seriously they were taking all this is open to question, and the efforts made to pass the band off as an authentic 1960s act whose record was the soundtrack to a 1960s film was perhaps somewhat undermined by the fact that a couple of the songs were credited to Vanian and Jug on the record label. Perhaps they assumed that most people wouldn't be paying that much attention. But obviously, songs from a 1967 movie were not going to have been written by a band who emerged 10 years later. Before too long, singles by Naz Nomad and the Nightmares were featuring the Damned's name in parentheses. So someone, be it the band or the record label, had decided that a joke could only go so far and that the records might actually sell more if people knew who was really behind them. The band did press interviews, initially as their fake characters, and then inevitably played a handful of gigs that would continue on and off until 1992. Once they appeared on stage, of course, disguises aside, the cat was effectively out of the bag. Listened to now, the album remains an entertaining slice of faux psych, at the time nostalgic, now seeming even weirder because the LP itself has become an authentically vintage piece, older now than a 1967 LP would have been in 1984. It's funny how nostalgia and retrospective memory works, with the music of the past all blurring into one homogeneous whole, with only the most pathetic of old men still clinging furiously to the tribal identities of their youth. So this album really can sit alongside the works of Moby Grape and Question Mark and the Mysterians. The context for the original recording has long since faded into the mists of time, and what we're left with now is an old record that sounds like other old records. What we're still missing, of course, is the film. More than the band, it was the film that was a genuinely fictional pastiche that existed only as a title, a fictional director, a few tantalising stills, and a plot synopsis. The music, no matter how it was presented, at least existed. The film, though, it feels like something that would sit alongside oddball hippie horrors like Angel, Angel, Down We Go and The Night God Screamed, a pre-Manson bad trip of broken youth and dark vibes. I can't tell you how much I really wish that Give Daddy the Knife Cindy was a real film. Hell, we had the soundtrack and the plot. Maybe somebody needs to make the movie. So do you remember Naz Nomad and the Nightmares? Were you at all fooled by the album, at least briefly? Let everybody know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and help us bring you more curious tales like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.